This is the Benefits Buzz Podcast, your weekly pulse on what's happening in the world of employee benefits. Brought to you by your friends at WEX, who believe in simplifying benefits for everyone. Now listen up and let's get buzzed!
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Benefits Buzz. I'm your host, Nathan Coverstone, and today we've got a really exciting episode for you. We're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how it leads and ties into your talent acquisition strategies. So on that, I've got two very exciting people I want to introduce. First, my co-host, who may be a little bit familiar to y'all if you checked out seasons 1 through 5 of the Benefits Buzz podcast. Eric Piella, thank you so much.
Run it back.
Yeah, thank you. So good to be back. I'm pumped to be here for this episode especially because we got another awesome guest, don't we?
Oh, our guest chose,
veteran.
without saying, an amazing guest, Laura Shen, our Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer here at WEX. Laura, thank you so much for coming on the pod.
Of course, this is like a fireside chat right here with you all.
Absolutely is. Welcome. So great to have you here.
Pleasure. Excited to dive in.
You know, I appreciate you saying that. Let's do it. Let's get right to it. Because I read, bear with me, I just want to make sure I get these numbers right, a survey that said 51% of employees surveyed have actually formalized a DE&I strategy for their company. And another 44% surveyed have said that because of those strategies, they've changed their hiring practices. So my first question is, right out the gate, what exactly are we talking about when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Great question, Nathan. And I think for me, it's always helpful to ground us in the vernacular of what we're talking about, because I often think that it's just DEI. And then you're like, okay, well, we need to break down what is inclusion, what is diversity, and what does equity look like? And for me, it's really a journey. Like that is the spectrum. Is first is, inclusion is how do you make sure that everyone feels respected and feels like they belong within an organization? Diversity is how do we then celebrate the differences people bring, and differences being how they identify, the experiences they've had, and be able to bring that all together. And then equity is the hard stuff too. Equity is thinking about the processes that make it so that everyone can thrive and feel like they can achieve their full potential.
So it's a small thing. It's just
yeah. It's, there's 3 small worlds, not a loaded complex at all. But I think, and for me, it's, how do you build off of creating a sense of inclusion, then really foster that diversity, and then think about the structures in place that might prevent equity and try to improve those along the way.
Love that.
Yeah. Well, this episode is focusing on with that perspective lens, we're talking about talent acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to feel like maybe an obvious question, but I'm going to put it out there anyway, Lauren. There are obvious benefits of having a diverse workforce.
Yes.
They're numerous. Mm-hmm. Would you mind just sharing, in your perspective, what you think some of the biggest benefits are by having diversity?
Yeah, and I can talk about the why, because I think when I took on this role a year ago, I wanted to make sure that, why did we invest in DEI? Why did we create a team? Why did we formalize to the stats that other companies are doing as well? Why did we formalize that commitment? And so for us at WEX, we listened, because I think that's really important, both from the top and from the bottoms up, of what are we hearing and how do we synthesize that into a really clear framework around why is DEI important to WEX? And so for us, it's table stakes. Like our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, it is part of the vernacular when people refer to employers of choice. They just expect that to be the baseline. The second is that when we think about our growth aspirations as a company, we need to be able to think differently. We need to have diverse perspectives to be able to innovate and grow. We're a company that wants to double every 5 years. So to be able to do that, we have to think differently and have different skill sets and backgrounds at the tables. And the third is really thinking about when you invest in diversity, equity, inclusion, 1, you increase your access to talent, and 2, it creates a benefit for our customers. So from a talent standpoint, this is where we'll dive into in the conversation. By opening up that aperture for how we think about the talent pools we go after, we're able to look at a wide breadth and depth of skill sets and backgrounds that we wouldn't necessarily have understood had we not put that discrete focus on. And then we're also we're at Spark right now. We have customers and partners here from across the globe. they care about this. Like, we're here with DEI because it's part of the request for proposals. It is table stakes. So by investing in it, it becomes a competitive advantage for your organization. And last but not least, we're seeing, as a public company, we're privy to SEC regulations, both here in the US and in the other jurisdictions we're at. So we're really seeing a pressure from regulators and shareholders where we've already met that bar. It's how do we continue to exceed that and think about where that's going as well. So that's the four-pronged why.
I love it.
That's fantastic. Of course, that immediately leads me to ask the question. So what's the strategy to actually get DE&I rather into the hiring process? How are we actually making a strategic goal to get that accomplished?
Yeah, and I would say, you know, last year we committed to, as an organization, our board and our executive leadership committed to 2 DEI aspirational goals to achieve by 2025. And one was around achieving gender parity in leadership roles. The second was around increasing our representation of U.S. employees of color in leadership roles by 50%. So those are, you know, those are metrics out there. And I would say, as we think about achieving diversity with those two items in mind, talent acquisition is one strategy. I would also highlight that it's a mathematical equation. So it's talent acquisition, it's internal talent mobility, and it also is retention. So what I know today we're focusing on talent acquisition, but wanted to highlight that there are those levers, those 3 larger levels. And within that talent acquisition, we can dive into, like, what are the strategies there? What can you do?
Right.
Well, I want to do that. But what I also love to do is I love to tell people what not to do.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just as valuable as what you should do. And so I would love maybe to take a moment and be like, what should organizations avoid when they're creating their D&I strategy? Again, around talent acquisition specifically.
Yeah. I think the first one is, like, for me, what I found to be like the first pitfalls, don't just check boxes for boxes' states. We're not just, we're committed to DEI and talent acquisition, and we're just going to recruit people from these underrepresented groups. That is not how you do it. It really needs to be holistic. And I think part of, for me, I came to this role having worked in the business for a number of years beforehand. So getting to know what the culture of an organization is, what is authentic to what the values of the organization are. And I think DEI, all 3 of those words are deeply embedded in terms of our value proposition. So it's not a stretch to say, like, we do this because it's the right thing and it's the values we bring to the table. But I think in terms of the other pitfalls, it's, you know, I remember I came to this role and I hadn't worked in HR. So I'm probably, for those HR lifers, respect for those who are new. I empathize and I'm here, but I'm also saying, like, I think the world of HR is an incredible opportunity at this point in time to be able to think about, you know, it used to be thought of as compliance now, and then it was HR as human resources as functional. Like, it is people and culture, and it is accelerant to the business. So I think allowing that to be an accelerant for the business and not being, I think one of the pitfalls is, like, I would always check with your lawyers on things. Like, I think our HR lawyer is my best friend of how do we phrase things so that the intent and the impact are aligned. And that's probably the biggest thing, is making sure intent and impact as it comes to your company's policies and values are in line there.
I love that. Yeah. So as I think about these things, I understand that we have goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and certainly we're looking to drive up those percentages within the organization. But I have to ask, for a lot of protected groups, self-identification is not required. So in those instances, how are we able to successfully recruit individuals that may be of a diverse workforce and hit those goals when we can't actively go out and seek individuals?
That is a great question, Nathan. And I think that was part of the diving into legal, data policy, compliance, risk when I took on this role, because you really have to get beneath the surface and say, okay, yes, oftentimes, like for WEX, we have a global gender metric because we can measure gender globally. We have a goal around US racial and ethnic diversity because it's something we can measure. But I would say there's other protected classes and underrepresented groups that we provide the option to disclose, but it's not something we require, and thus becomes hard to put a metric to, which is why we haven't put a metric to it. But I think the other element is, like, what are you proactively doing in those spaces, and how are you understanding, for example, one of the initiatives we took during 2021, I believe, was looking at military spouses and military family members who are oftentimes constrained by geographic location or might have to move based on a spouse who it might be stationed somewhere else. And so thinking about, how do we think about, now that we're flexible and we provide more remote working opportunities, how do we tap into those populations of prospective talent that we hadn't beforehand and really make cognizant efforts? So part of it is thinking about stepping back and saying, what are the protected classes that we really feel strongly and have the capacity to support? And then having a bias towards action. I think there's so many different ways you can take this. And I think that's where DEI can often feel overwhelming, is you're trying to be everything to everyone, and you can't do it all at once. So whether it's veterans, whether it's the LGBTQ plus community, whether it's, specific, Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian communities, you're going to have to make trade-offs, but it's also thinking about how do you want to pace yourself through that journey? And I think about accessibility and some of our how do we think about physical disabilities, neurodiversity, in ways that actually can be an advantage in some of these workspaces, particularly around neurodiversity. And we think about technology and where are there pockets that are just untapped that we can go after. So I think it is it's an art, and it's also, there's a little bit of patience to it.
For our listeners at home, Laura just referenced WEX accessibility, and just a little bit of background. One of the things that WEX does is it provides employee resource groups where individuals that identify with any number of diversity, equity, or inclusion kind of spaces can help support each other and work to actually initiate proactive change to make a better work environment. It really leads back into our value proposals at WEX, and transparently, WEX accessibility is one that is near and dear to my heart. Because I'm the board chair for WEX accessibility.
So Nathan and I spend a lot of time together beyond benefits buzz.
To my benefit. But so just wanted to let everybody know what that was and why we were talking about it. So really exciting. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I think one of the really great points too with the employee resource groups is being able to empower those groups to advocate and increase awareness across the organization. But I know, for example, talent acquisition came in February to talk about, here's our roadmap for this year. Does it resonate with the groups here? What else do you want to see?
Absolutely.
So it's really creating that two-way dialogue and providing an opportunity to voice that in a way that has a seat at the table in spaces and places that those groups might not have otherwise yielded.
Absolutely.
Curious, when you were working with talent acquisition around it, this is the Benefits Buzz podcast. I miss saying that, by the way. Sorry.
It's fun to say.
It's fun to say. Right. So I have to ask, how do benefits play into all this? And should organizations be thinking about benefits from a DE&I standpoint? And what does that even look like, Laura?
Such a good
Is
question.
that a thing?
Oh,
That's a good question.
benefits.
Yeah.
They're an incredible lever in terms of what can be also another competitive advantage for employers, but really thinking not just benefits as your standard package of
Sure.
tell me what your healthcare policy, how many days off am I getting a year? But really thinking about what's the inclusive nature of those benefits, and how do you support employees in the moments that matter, ones that are emotionally charged that they might not know where to go. How can the employer play that switchboard in a way that really empathizes and supports people through what oftentimes can be really difficult situations? So when I think about the plethora and that package of inclusive benefits that WEX offers, I think about healthcare and making it not just accessible in terms of you can sign up during open enrollment and when you onboard, but really thinking about how do you educate people around how this can improve their livelihoods and personal lives outside of the office, because employers aren't just somewhere you go 9 to 5 anymore. First of all, you might just be at home 9 to 5 while also being employed, but really thinking about how do you support that mental health and flexibility. So when I think about inclusive benefits, I think about not just our healthcare programs, but how they support a family and whatever version of family that looks like for you. I think about bereavement leave, things that when times get tough, how is an employer there to support you? I think about last year we added conception benefits. So thinking about covering, family building, family planning, IVF, like we have a child on the way, sponsored by WEX, I suppose. And so that for us is really like personally what I'm super passionate about, but also thinking about, okay, what does parental leave look like? What does, for people who might identify with a protected class, what are the other elements? And so we've also partnered really closely, our ERGs, not only with talent acquisition, but also with our benefits team to provide feedback of what are the challenges, ailments, things that might be associated with certain groups that the benefits group can help better frame for employees.
Laura, we've got listeners out there that are looking at building out their own DE&I strategy and really trying to incorporate that into the hiring process. What would you advise them as far as positive outcomes? How to identify positive outcomes from building that into the hiring practice?
Yeah, I think one is really taking a step back and understanding your why. And then also, thinking about knowing that talent acquisition is one component, breaking down the talent acquisition process. I think one, it's always great to start with a baseline of like, where are you today? What does your pipeline look like? How many applicants are you getting? What does the applicant pool look like? Who are you interviewing? How large is that? And what is the group of folks that you're bringing in and onboarding and hiring? Because talent acquisition, when I think about that process, there's the search process, there's the interview, and there's the offer. And so I think within each of those three, you can think about, okay, now what are the tactics there? So I know.
Yeah.
Finding a framework. I mean, you can take, like, this isn't about box ticking, but it's also thinking about like what are the things you can tangibly take from this. And so when you think about the search process, how are you thinking about really having a clear job description and role clarity up front, the language you use in job descriptions to make that inclusive so that people don't like have a bias about themselves that might exclude them from the process.
Oh, that's great.
Thinking about your referral processes. I know for one of the things that we've done with WAX is like gone to our ERG groups and say, these are some really high profile roles. If you have folks in your network, we would appreciate you pushing it out, because referrals are a great way to bring people in. But if your referral base looks and feels the same or has similar backgrounds, like that won't be a diverse way of doing things.
What a great... How do you measure success? You start having the very people that are the diverse workforce starting to support getting more people in diversity.
I mean, part of it's also making sure they have a positive experience too.
Of course. That's really good.
We've also at the senior levels at WEX rolled out diverse slates. So I'm not sure if people who are familiar with NFL or the Rooney Rule, it is one tactic amongst many of ways of thinking about diversity in the hiring process. I know it can be controversial when talking about the NFL, and diverse slates, for those who might not be familiar, is requiring at the interview stage there be at least one female and one person of color in that. And I think that really, it can challenge talent acquisition professionals to make sure they can solicit from a wide pool. And it might just take longer to fill some of those roles. And those are going to be the trade-offs that you have to make, because no one said any of this was easy. No. So you do have to understand what the trade-offs will be at certain points if you go down some of these specific tactical routes. So that's really around the search. When you think about the interview, it's how do you manage expectations around this is how, like, you'll have this interview, then you'll have that interview, and then this is the time frame in which we plan to make a decision. Just having that transparency from the beginning, I think, helps put applicants at ease around what the criteria are. Having a scorecard internally, knowing what are the things you made this role about and how is that being demonstrated so that you can quantify some of that of like, well, candidate A, they scored 3 on communications and this is a communications role versus candidate B scored 4. So regardless, that's going to be the one that's probably a better fit. And I would also be careful about fit is how do you think about cultural fit versus cultural add? Are you trying to create too much of a box around what is a WEXer versus creating the space for being like, we want to continue to evolve what that looks like? I also think it's like not just a diverse slate of candidates, but also who do you have interviewing that individual? Do they bring a variety of perspectives to what that interviewee will experience about the organization? Wow. And then last but not least, Nathan, and I don't even sit in talent acquisition, but I feel really passionately about it. I love all of it. Is about the offer is, how do you think about pay equity as part of that, making sure that that role is paid comparable to other roles? And if, by chance someone declines, have a conversation. Like, what was it about it? What could we do to improve in those scenarios? And be able to have that conversation, because you never know when there might be another opportunity down the line.
I had really never considered the just depth of where literal inclusivity and equity is existing in all these stages of the talent acquisition process.
I was just thinking, I forget how much I love coming on this podcast because I learned so stinking much. I'm like, yeah, you unpacked so much in your response, and I love it. I know everyone that's in TA that's listening, I hope are taking copious notes, because there's a lot to consider.
Yeah.
And it's important work that's part of this. So when we sit down and we think about episodes, we like to sit down with our producers and we like to think of all the right questions to really uncover the best pieces around this topic. But I know we missed some stuff, and so this is our last question, where we're like, what didn't we ask you? What do you want to share with our listeners about DE&I when it comes to talent acquisition that we just didn't get a chance to do so yet?
I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I just skimmed the surface. I think one is, it's hard. Like, none of this is easy. It's a journey. I'm someone who comes from the business and likes to win. There will be wins along the way in this journey, but know that it will take, prioritization, trying to figure out what works and what is authentic to the organization that you're part of. And I think the nice part is, like, as a partner here, lean on others. I think HR can sometimes feel like a lonely space because, it's HR. But I think there's such a community around it. So really leaning into, what are your customers doing? What are your partners doing? What are peers? And finding those groups of peers. Like, it's great to be at Spark and to be, particularly around some of the benefits customers who this is a competitive advantage. The more we're hearing about it in interview feedback of like, oh, I chose WEX because of its commitment to DEI, or I chose WEX because of the experience I had as part of the interview and the people I met. I think that's a real big differentiator in this hyper competitive market. Anything we can do to put our best foot forward and make sure that what we preach from the inside really emanates outside. And so, I think a lot of it is making sure that all the work you're doing gets communicated outward too, so that you could be doing your benefits like within the benefits total rewards program, but it needs to be able to be shared externally. So when someone asks like, oh, what's your coverage for this? You're like, actually, here you go. But here's the story around it too. Yeah. This is the value add.
I love this. So literally doing good is good for business.
Yeah, that's weird.
That's fantastic.
Can you just come on the podcast every week?
Yeah,
Laura, you're such a fantastic guest.
Well, thank you all for having me.
Well, thank you for being here, Laura. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for helping co-host again and continuing to mentor me. And thank you all for listening and for checking out Benefits Buzz again. If you haven't already, please subscribe, leave us a review. We want to hear from you so we can start focusing on what you'd like to hear. Thanks a lot, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
WEX is in the business of simplifying benefits for everyone. Now, although we certainly hope our podcast sparks some aha moments, like that was pretty cool, but of course we cannot provide legal, investment, or financial advice. And, well, therefore, nothing shared in this podcast should be interpreted as such. We encourage you to seek out appropriate professional advice regarding your plans. Hey, congratulations! You made it through our disclaimer. Thanks for listening.